So great to see you all. Thank you so much. The Beauty, really excited about the opportunity to have you share your perspective and your knowledge around such a critical issue facing our world as healthcare providers, as communities. This is a really important time, and so I'm excited to have the opportunity to introduce you. I don't have anything but praise to throw at you. All your credentials are actually not in front of me, but more a heartfelt. We've served in a number of spaces together, and your perspective has always been so enlightening to everyone around. And so, thank you for the opportunity to get a piece of your time and your knowledge to share with our membership. I'm going to turn this back over to Jenny so that she can provide some of your amazing credentials for the betterment of this. But I just wanted to have an opportunity to welcome you and thank you and share a little of my personal experience. So thank you.
Yes, Vibhuti Arya has worked for the past 15 years to bridge the gap between healthcare, well-being, and equity. Dr. Arya brings together her experiences in public health, social justice, education, theater, and mindfulness to create brave spaces to serve people and systems intentionally working towards dismantling structural racism. In her day job as clinical professor at St. John's University College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences and clinical advisor to the New York City Health Department, Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, Dr. Arya works to integrate pharmacists into public health initiatives, particularly among high-risk, medically underserved areas in New York City, advises on legislation pertinent to pharmacy practice and access to care, and serves on the agency's Institutional Review Board. To date, she has been engaged with several efforts, including public health detailing, expanding naloxone access through community pharmacies, syndromic surveillance, and emergency preparedness. Through her teaching, Dr. Arya engages her students to examine public health programs and policies through the lens of equity, applying social justice principles and frameworks to help reduce inequalities in care. Dr. Arya is a global lead for gender equity and diversity workforce development for the International Pharmacy Federation. She earned her PharmD from St. John's University, completed the Pharmaceutical Care Leadership Residency at University of Minnesota, and her MPH from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Welcome. Thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you so kindly. Jenny, if you don't mind, just a quick thumbs up if you can hear me okay. I'm hoping that the audio is fine.
Yes, very clear.
Thank you. Perfect. I just want to say, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for continuing this conversation that's so much needed in our space, certainly. I know that people are really on edge right now because of the elections and everything that's happening. So hopefully this conversation can provide us some reflection on sort of the totality of everything that's going on. In many cases, I kind of liken this experience a little bit to, we've all known sort of structural racism and everything is here, similar to maybe a patient encounter you may have had, or where you felt like I'm not ready for this conversation, or I'm just not there, and things sort of keep getting delayed, or there's that paper you really want to do or write and you just don't want to deal with it right now. And we've kind of been delaying this conversation for many years, I would say, certainly in our profession. And so now the patient's in front of us. Now this topic is in front of us, and we don't want to squander the opportunity to discuss it. We don't want to squander the opportunity to take a moment and reflect in terms of our relationship with it, but really, how we're going to be on the side of history that sort of will tackle this. And so I invite you today to not only take with this conversation what it brings for you personally, but think about the implications that it has. I was happy to hear some questions in the earlier session about, how do foods relate to a patient with, where you have to have renal function sort of considered. And so I think we're starting to tackle a lot of the totality of what we're dealing with in terms of patient care. So I want to sort of start off by offering this text that I had gotten from a friend back in March, as we may all remember, that this year has been tumultuous, to say the least, for all of us. For those of us who've had the privilege of being in a safe home, in stable sort of jobs and income streams, we have been able to hopefully take this time to reflect on our families and spend time in a way that really has been unprecedented. But what it also has brought up was a lot of sort of coming to face with inequities that we know have existed for so long, but just sort of have come to the surface in a very, very deliberate and visceral manner. But what I'd like to take is also during that time of pause with the pandemic, and this is, of course, a memorial in Minneapolis after the murder of George Floyd, and I trained in the Twin Cities for my residency and lived there for 2.5 years. And so, it strikes hard when you're seeing the duality of everything that's happening and really the intersection of sorts of things coming into play. So certainly you've got a lot of pain and things coming through, and then there's also things that the perspectives that we're hearing, and there's a lot of dissonance that's been brought up in terms of how do we deal with this? Where are we? Do we bury our head in the sand because it's just too overwhelming, or do we stand up? Do we say what's right or wrong? Do we come to terms with what's happening? And so what I want to offer is that although this year has brought with it such a visceral pain that many have experienced and have been empathetic to, and perhaps have tapped into some of this compassion that really we need to come together. We've also seen through this pain the coming of the collective. We've seen how we can appreciate essential workers and healthcare teams who are putting their lives on the risk just to get us some delivery, just to get us some groceries, to help our patients, to help our loved ones. To find a way that we can say goodbye to loved ones and colleagues in the hospital who have passed away from COVID, even though we can't visit them in person. And so I know I personally have lost colleagues and people that I've known to COVID, and it's brought with it a lot of heaviness that I think that many of us have not had to experience all at once. But what I also want to point out is that this year has brought with it sort of a reimagining of things that we never knew possible. I don't know if there are any Hamilton fans out here. My family is gung-ho Hamilton fans. And one of the things that, even in something looking at access to Broadway, this thing that was sort of unreachable unless you had to get on a queue for tickets for years and years and years, now is being streamed multiple times throughout televisions across this country and globally. And really there's a conversation happening, the opportune time of how this intersects with what's happening in this world, and people talking about the founding fathers, even way more than I've ever heard it being spoken about in mainstream conversation about how this country was formed and intended to be, and some of the problematic pieces of the history and what that means for us. But what I also really appreciated was this sort of reimagining that we get to do in how we want this world to be. How do we want to parent our children to remember this time? How do we make a commitment to ourselves and our communities? How do we expand our communities to a global world, to communities that go beyond our own zip code? How do we understand policies and the foundation of this country and what we want it to be? So I'll invite you on this journey to not only understand how this pain has been reflected for this year in your own lives, but also how do you want to reimagine this world and certainly this country and our communities to be? How do we want to deliberately act in ways that make us question our own assumptions and question how we contribute to the system, either intentionally or unintentionally? And so our time today really will be focused on understanding structural racism, how it has impacted health equity that really dearly touches all of us in no matter what setting you're in pharmacy practice. We're going to talk a little bit about how we got here, where do we go and how do we actually get there? And there will be some time of discomfort here. I want to disclaim that just having one conversation or a workshop or a session like this is not going to somehow make us anti-racist or enlightened. It's sort of just scratching the surface of our own journeys, kind of going within. And I would just ask you to think about, as you become vulnerable through this session and also these conversations, what are the ways in which you can commit to yourself to act on that vulnerability? Do you tense up and get defensive, or sort of find yourself deflecting from the topic? Do you want to lean into it a little bit more and embrace that discomfort? And I always remind everybody, you know, emotions are data. They tell us information. And so as we go through this not only this conversation today, but as you extend these conversations, what are these emotions that you may be experiencing telling you? And so I always tell people to grab a pen and write down any notes or any things that they're feeling, any questions that may come up. And certainly we can have room for questions later, but also that questions that you may want to address within yourself and your friends and families as well. And so let's get down to it. And, you know, in typical academic fashion, we love charts and graphs. We love data. I'm a data geek. But here's a very complicated way to help you understand that as a yoga teacher, there's a saying that we subscribe to that says, too much tension will kill you, and not enough tension means you're dead. And so what I hope to have you do is kind of offer you this green zone of just enough tension and just enough discomfort that makes you pause and kind of grow and do the work necessary. But if you find yourself sort of getting to that panic zone where the red is, where it's getting too hot, just take a sip of water, take a deep breath, and again, write down anything that's coming to you and what triggered you to go there. So I would just ask you to move from the comfort into this sort of little bit of a discomfort zone and come with us on this journey. So for starters, one of the things that I want to point out is this difference between equality and equity. We've heard these terms. I hope that some of these terms will bring to light some of these concepts in a very real way. But equality is sort of this rule, right? This concept that every single rule has to apply very fairly and in the same manner to everybody. So everybody has a fair shot. It's all the same chance, etc. And it's deep-rooted in the assumption that everybody's starting at the same point of the line. And equity really is understanding the inherent differences that may contribute to somebody starting at a different point in that line than anybody else. And so it's meeting somebody where they are. And the reason I like this depiction of the bicycles is that certainly you can understand that, you know, a 4-year-old is not going to ride an adult bicycle with their parent or guardian the same way you'd have to get them a separate helmet and a separate bicycle to meet them where they are and where their abilities are and where they are in that journey. In that same way, in the spirit of equity, it's really talking societally as a concept of meeting groups and people where they are and really sort of understanding why those differences exist in the first place. So that's the difference between equality and equity. And I will say even this concept sometimes sort of shatters that foundation that we all likely grew up in, which is that everybody should have the fair chance, the same rule applies to everybody else. And so sometimes it kind of makes us who we are, right? We're fair people, we're just people because we want the same rules for everybody, and that's just how it has to be. And when we start pivoting to this idea about equity, sometimes it can shake us in our foundational understanding of how we're supposed to show up for people. And so I offer this visual for you to understand that sometimes we just kind of have to meet people, and there are inherent differences between groups, and where people are starting off in that line will be very different. And so when we talk about health equity, what we really are saying is that any single person should be able to attain the highest level of health for themselves without any regards to their social position or really any other socially determined circumstance. And this, of course, adopted from the most recent version of Healthy People 2030 and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Very clear sort of foundation that we want everybody to be able to obtain health for their own healthy sort of status. When we think about determinants of health, right, what are we really talking about with all of these terms? If you think about when we were in pharmacy school or wherever we have gone to school and really learning about disease processes, clinical care is about 10%, maybe 20% if you consider genes and biology as well, of really the determinants of illness, essentially, right? How healthy somebody is or how ill somebody might be. Clinical care is a very small piece of that pie, yet we spend years training for that. We spend years hopefully perfecting and mastering this craft and contributing ourselves to lifelong learning without recognizing in a very deliberate manner that all of these social and economic factors that then lead to health behaviors and include that physical and built environment around for our patients actually have a lot more to do with their determinants of health. And so what does this mean? The Centers for Disease Control in prevention and the Healthy People 2030, they come up with sort of these, have put these 5 domains forward for us to think about in terms of education, healthcare, economic stability. You know, how much can we afford medication? If there was a disaster right now in your neighborhood, in your community, would you be able to relocate yourself and your family? Would you be able to identify somebody within your friend circle or your social capital or your family who could provide you shelters with enough room in their house, with enough space in their homes, but also their own capital? And all of these things have a lot to do with how somebody can make it in life in terms of being healthy and not having to worry about being bankrupt from a hospitalization. When we drill down further into these domains, what we're really talking about is a totality of all of these factors. We're talking about stable income. In the US, healthcare is still tied to a point of employment. And so we find ourselves in situations where folks are more concerned about their health and benefits that they get, and that goes a lot of factor into choosing their job rather than to maximize their talents and productivity and contribution to that sector. And so when we talk about economic stability, we're going beyond just an income stream. We're talking about expenses. We're talking about caregiving. Do they have others in their families that they're responsible for? We're talking about medical bills and debt. We talk about built environments in these neighborhoods, not only with having shelter, but really with having stable shelter. We're talking about transportation to work and commute times. We're talking about safety and sights of visibility, and when we cross the street, making sure that we can see if a car or another vehicle is coming to approach us and our children as we're crossing. We're talking about playgrounds and how walkable our neighborhoods are. It extends beyond into then not only just literacy, but also health literacy and how we understand how to make decisions about healthcare. Do we have the same eating options? Do we have the same food options as our patients? And most of the time as providers, we are working and serving our patients, and especially patients in vulnerable neighborhoods that we are out of touch with. We don't live in those neighborhoods the same way that our patients do. We do not frequent those neighborhoods. We do not understand that their options are so much different than what our options may be. And so the totality of the social determinants of health are really social determinants of illness. We need to also then consider, how do we take these social determinants to truly understand how to make people healthier, right? And so these support systems, particularly in the time of COVID with this pandemic, we are missing that community engagement. We are missing the support systems. You know, I did a talk for the community districts here in Brooklyn, New York. And one of the things we find of folks of color living in communities in multi-generational households, you know, even the notion of isolation or quarantining is so difficult when you consider multi-generational households. We consider elderly living on their own without having their children or loved ones or young ones coming by to visit them. And so the importance of FaceTime has never been, you know, more sort of heavily emphasized. And we're talking about checkpoints and making sure that we're reaching out to each other in unexpected ways. But all of the totality of this really is what we're talking about when it comes to social determinants. And so how does this manifest in the lives of our patients? I offer you these statistics that really haven't changed much for infant mortality. Infant mortality rate, of course, is one of the factors that are being used globally, really, to understand the health of a nation. It is the single most, one of the fundamental ways in which we understand whether a nation is putting enough resources, certainly, but also to measure sort of a nation's health. And when we look at these statistics year after year after year, for those of you who might be too young, but remember that year 1991, right? In the 1990s, infant mortality rate was about 10.3 per 100,000 live births. That has more than doubled in 2014 to 23.8 for Black women in America. And as we continue to look at these rates that have been so troubling, as a nation, perhaps the rates may be okay, but when you really try to look at the cross-section of race and ethnicity data, we find these disparities over and over again. What's interesting is that African women who actually come to America to give and give birth here actually have very similar rates of infant mortality as those of white women, because their prenatal care was back in their home country. And so there's something about being Black and living in America that proves to be very unhealthy, so to speak, and a bit of a danger when it comes to Black mothers. And, I have friends who are debating whether they should have a second kid as they're moving to different places for jobs because of this. So I invite you to remember that these are not just numbers and data. They are people. There are mothers, there are sisters and daughters who potentially have such risk that they are not able to see their children's first milestones. They are not able to make it through that stage to then grow with their children. And, the natural question comes into play that, well, perhaps this is due to socioeconomic status or poverty. And even though when we adjust for those, we have still seen over and over again that Black women, even those who are highly educated, continue to have these dismal sort of records when it comes to this. And Black women very specifically are sometimes 3 to 4 times more likely to actually die in childbirth, regardless of socioeconomic status. And so the World Health Organization has actually said that Black women living in the US have maternal health rates that really are the same as Mexico and Uzbekistan. And I offer that to you because it brings a realization to all of us that the America that we experience on a daily basis is very different depending on who we are. And so you and I may not experience this country in that same exact way. And so again, there is something to this, and we need to understand what those factors are in order to mitigate the negative impacts. I hope you remember who this woman is. This is, of course, Serena Williams, who is one of the most famed sports figures in the history, I think, globally, certainly in the United States, but also globally. She's basically the Beyonce of sports. And essentially, the story I'm about to tell, or the tale, is really something that impacted them both in their own journey. So these are 2 very powerful Black women who have income, who have physicians and care teams at their disposal, who are married to public figures. And so their wealth is not something of concern when it comes to getting true, sort of good delivery of care. Yet both of these women's complaints as they were talking about their pregnancies were ignored and led them to precarious situations where they both actually had pretty close encounters with death. And I have lots of friends and family who have encountered this. If you speak to other Black women who have encountered their own stories around this, there are a lot of implicit biases and these associations of ignoring pain as a factor or ignoring, some of these patient concerns that really come to light when we talk about these stories. And so even though the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention now has this big campaign actually about maternal health, we continue to see the disparate outcomes. We continue to see that American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Black women are still 2 to 3 times more likely to die of pregnancy-related causes than white women. And I want to point out that most of these are preventable, that most of these are signs and things that really that are preventable. And so again, the same way that we think about medication errors as pharmacists to be so preventable and things that we actually have control over, I invite you to carry that same that empathy and compassion into hearing our patients' complaints as well, because their stories and their narratives, many of which have long been suppressed and forgotten, that these are important for us to recognize and respond to when it comes to our patients, because it very well could save their lives. And we see this in other areas as well, in prescription opioids. Some of you have seen this disparity happen in your own pharmacy practice setting, where we see that Black individuals are actually less likely than white individuals to be prescribed opioids. And we see this also happening for surgeries and traumatic injuries. We see that pharmacies in poor white neighborhoods are actually much more likely to stock opioids. We still see disparities in medication-assisted treatment, where we have insurance coverage issues, where we have communities of color who are being subjected to urine tests every single day and to show up to a clinic in order to receive their medications, where other neighborhoods that are largely white are having better access and again, more of a dignified approach to get their medications delivered and not having to pee and go through drug screens, et cetera. We also have seen sort of an evolving narrative of this, right? We used it to be called addiction, and now it's more about substance use disorder. 10, 20, 30 years ago, when we had people who were dying, largely Black communities, of opioid overdose, we, referred to it as a moral character flaw, versus now we call it families impacted by the opioid epidemic. We have now been co-prescribing naloxone left and right. I have trained in New York City. We've had huge amounts of naloxone training. I'm a trainer there. I've trained people on street corners. We've trained people in jails. We've trained people in settings of academia. We've trained people everywhere to really carry naloxone kits anywhere and everywhere they may be able to witness an opioid overdose death. We've got tremendous amount of funding that's coming through for co-prescribing of naloxone, or even just making naloxone available through really lay people, fire departments, police, pharmacies, places where we didn't really see this happening before. And the narrative has shifted when we saw a very clear demographic trend shifting as to more white families being impacted by the opioid overdose because of opioid overdoses. We now have also adopted pain as a vital sign, which, you know, never used to be the case. And so as we see this evolving of narratives, and I'm so proud that pharmacy has been at the forefront of advocating for this change of legislation being introduced to actually have pharmacists prescribe buprenorphine and get involved in medication-assisted treatment. You know, I always kind of pose this question of naloxone, $40 for 2 doses of naloxone in a kit, and where were we when this medication was widely available? Where were we where we could have saved those lives? Where were we when we could have shown up in a way that had more compassion with these Black neighborhoods and these brown neighborhoods, where we could have saved lives for people and turned around their family dynamic and given folks a second chance that their homes were not broken, and not turn away from providing care and from providing treatment because we thought it was some sort of moral character flaw. So it's a very sombering moment, not only for the world, but also for us as a profession to think about our role and what role we play in our day-to-day care, and really around shaping policy and programs and interventions when it comes to this. And so as a patient, what your patients are experiencing is what we now know to be this weathering effect, kind of like an erosion of sorts of the spirit, where there are negative biological, there are actually outcomes that are negative, that are directly related to how we cope with race-related stress consistently over time. So if you can sort of think about this as a baseline anxiety level just being really high, right? Like these walking around with tense shoulders all the time, not knowing when you're going to be stopped, not knowing when your concern may not be heard, going in with this sort of fight attitude that you have to advocate 1,000 times for your voice to be heard. And all of that, if you can think of a toxic work environment that you've ever been in and what that did to your body, mind, and spirit, think about walking every single day in your lived experience with that heaviness on your shoulders, and then carrying that forward with your children. And so when we think about the interventions, the journal clubs, the articles that we read, we still think about clinical interventions and counseling and education that we actually ask folks to individually take accountability for. And one of the former commissioners for the New York City Health Department, Tom Frieden, offered this health impact pyramid, that if actually, because of all of this that's been happening, we took the time to focus on population impact through policies and programs that impact socioeconomic factors, that we actually have the power, we have the impact, we have the control and power to influence for generations to come in population level health. And I see pharmacists getting more and more engaged, and I think because we're realizing that this is where we can swim upstream, so that our patients are not showing up with 16 different medications that are actually causing them more harm than good because they don't understand how to take these, that their lives and their food choices are not ideal, and that if we actually want to make a difference in our patients' lives, that we need to think about how these socioeconomic factors and these social determinants are impacting them in every single way imaginable. And so how did we actually get here? And the reason we need to focus on these is actually because the country and our doings and all these policies of the past have led us to be here. The map on the left, of course, is one of redlining. If you may have heard of it, it was a practice really after World War II as well, when neighborhoods were sort of redlined and deemed uninhabitable. And, you know, my team and I, when we were doing some of these, looking at data and looking further into comparing how redlining has impacted New York City neighborhoods, for example, we took these maps where New York City neighborhoods were redlined, and we took the maps of today and overlaid them, and there was just a blatant, visceral, proof and testimony of how the impact of these historical legacies and policies that continued to put these neighborhoods that were redlined at risk for disease burden. It was a very clear depiction of how those neighborhoods continue to this day struggle in manners that cause them to have more disease burden, more mortality, and more morbidity when it comes to these chronic diseases. And so when we looked at the forms that actually asked about, I was like, how did they deem these neighborhoods to be uninhabitable? And we actually looked up at these forms, and there was a depiction there, and I'm going to be explicit about percent Negro. And when we saw that, our team sort of just paused and felt that very viscerally, because there was no other demographic information on that page. And so what that told us was, while some may think that this might have been a case where it was implicitly denoted, we think there was a pretty explicit reaction to this. And when folks saw Black folks in these communities were deemed uninhabitable. And so growth and community infrastructure in those neighborhoods did not continue to happen. And it's actually, while other communities were flourishing and getting banks and getting grocery stores, these communities that were redlined were being left in the dirt. And what has been estimated is that it will take about 8 generations to reverse the impacts of redlining on these communities. And what I would like to invite us all to do is maybe think about ways in which we can be intentional about not letting it take 8 generations, about making sure that we are part of the fight in those policies, in those programming, and the way that we set up our own structures within our spheres of influence to help mitigate some of these negative impacts, and also to dismantle structural racism. And so these historical legacies after World War II, I mentioned when veterans came back, and they needed housing. That's really this idea of the single family home in suburbia was created, but Black veterans were not privy to that, to receiving that benefit. And so it again begs us the question that these historical legacies, how have they impacted us? And what I'm offering here is that these historical legacies and the way that our country was created, and certainly has manifested globally, is that these policies and practices continue to perpetuate that structural racism, both implicitly and explicitly. And I'd argue that there still are laws in this country today. Certainly we can see this being pronounced right now with voter suppression of laws that may not be explicitly racist, but still have very, very racist consequences to this day. And so all of that also has then led to this hoarding of resources within communities and within groups, where Black and brown folks have been left trying to just survive paycheck to paycheck, or put things together, but not being privy to 401ks or benefits packages and all of these kinds of things, because their generational sort of advancement or the upward mobility socially has kind of been restricted. And so here's where we kind of come together and say, okay, so we can now understand that all these structural ways in which racism has been called to be a root cause of these social determinants of health, of housing segregation, et cetera, these practices. And really it starts from childhood in understanding what is expected. There are tons of studies here in Black and brown communities specifically of not having expectations for children, and really holding funding and withholding funding from communities. And so when we talk about things such as policies related to defunding police, et cetera, what we're, through all the misinformation, not realizing is that it's not denigrating the profession. It's not saying that, all of these groups are evil, but really to say that, can Black and brown neighborhoods please still have the same kind of dignity and funding, for example, that white neighborhoods do, where a lot of that funding that goes into these neighborhoods is less on policing and more on education, for example. And so these neighborhoods, for these children to have opportunity to have that upward mobility. And so after Hurricane Katrina, there was this wonderful book that was written, and really one of the predictors for children and for people to make it out of that disaster was social capital. And again, all of that starts from childhood. Think about all the ways in which we know somebody who can get our child an internship, or we ourselves have conversations that we bring in and what our children are exposed to just because we're professionals. And so extending that empathy to other groups of kids as well, who are not our own and who don't stop at a zip code or in our communities and look different than we do. And so it's really important for us to carry that empathy and that compassion, I would say, even further. And so the way that we've seen this manifest and why we say racism is a social determinant, because there are certain gaps that continue, again, from this historical legacies and policies, where we can still see that folks, when you're looking at Black and white communities, unemployment rates continue to be on rise. There's a very disparate change or difference in home ownership rate, right? Which you can imagine building assets in families. You know, who gets college educated, who gets thrown in prison or jail, and how that has an impact on families and communities. We look at different kinds of things about outcomes and life expectancy at birth. So all of these things still are very much alive in our social fabric. These are the stories of our patients when they walk through, that they may not tell you, but that we have an obligation to screen for and understand what their totality of the situation is. And not to assume things either, but asking those questions and realizing that the choices our patients are making and why they're forced to make them might be just a little bit different than ours. And so institutional racism, when we talk about it, occurs on the level of these institutions that sort of perpetuate policies and practices and systems within these institutions to actually continue to create racialized outcomes. And this could be intentional or unintentional. So for example, faith-based organizations or our schools and churches and our colleges, you know, networking receptions that we get, or STEM opportunities for folks to understand, you know, how do we recruit people in the pharmacy program? You know, which schools do we go to in middle schools and high schools to recruit our future pharmacists? And when we look at the totality of this, what we recognize and what we offer is that racial equity is both an outcome and a process. And we say it's an outcome, that we've achieved it when race actually no longer determines outcomes. So when we do those analyses of home ownership rates or income, that Black and white doesn't have to have such a gap all the time. And we use racial equity as a process when those who are actually impacted by racism are involved in the decisions that are going to impact their lives and their communities' lives. And so even the World Health Organization, they have a Commission on Social Determinants of Health, have really pointed out that this is not a case of individual behavior. This is not a case where I, the beauty, decide to eat badly or not exercise and therefore have certain predispositions to conditions. It is structural roots that have contributed to these avoidable differences, right? That individuals actually have little or no direct personal control over them. And that really they rely on these systems and these processes that we need to then come to recognize how they impact these social determinants. And so structural racism, we say, sort of occurs underneath, all around, and across these institutions. It's a cumulative effect of these factors that systematically have advantaged white people and disadvantaged people of color. And so there's an offer of reflection here to think about, you know, how have we, in our lived experiences and our exposures and our education, come to understand and been impacted by this. And I offer that privilege is not just what you experience and what you see, it's also what you don't have to experience on a daily level and what you don't have to see on a daily level. In many ways, this time has allowed us to open up our eyes and our lens to understand the ways in which we can think about the ways in others' shoes, how they've been impacted. And so I offered this hero cycle of socialization from the late 90s about really how this all comes to be. So because of these structural ways, we all have been socialized to have implicit biases. You know, when babies are born, they're not into this, right? They don't have biases, they're pure, but their parents and all of us and our relatives and our teachers, the people of the role models that we love and trust, shape the way that we can dream, the way that we can see ourselves, the way that we look at ourselves and have confidence. And as we further get along in our aging cycle, we see that institutions and our cultures, what we see on the media, what we read, how we practice, the language we have for all of these things shape our patterns of thought on both conscious and unconscious levels. And those sort of reinforce how we see things. And it is defines and shapes our cultural norms. So when we hear things such as don't throw like a girl, or don't hit like a girl, or don't cry, that makes you weak, we can pause and understand how problematic that may be. And this is not a black and white issue. It's not a male-female issue. It hurts everybody, because it hurts us to understand and have to fall into these social patterns that don't seem to be our own. It hurts those men who want to be good fathers, because being a good father or being there for your child is somehow problematically perceived to be weak and not in control. And so all of these things sort of shape the way we are, and it results in this sort of cognitive dissonance that we have that tells us, we've seen all these things that give us a certain message, but the experience I have gives me a different message. And so we have a certain choice at that moment, a la Robert Frost, about which road to take. Right? You can do nothing, and we can just kind of be like, forget it. I don't want to ruffle feathers. I don't want to, sort of disturb this situation. I might give something up. What if it hurts my job? What if it hurts something? Versus we can say, I need to figure out how to stand up for this. I need to figure out how to speak up and not be a bystander. I need to figure out how to actively be an ally in this. So as a woman who is cisgender, who is straight, and whose physical body is able to walk up and down stairs, it is my job and my responsibility to speak up when I see bullying or comments being made for my brethren, for my friends and family, or colleagues or peers, or people who are not my friends, who don't have access to ramps if they're in wheelchairs, who don't have or who are subject to comments that are denigrating and that are demoralizing based on their gender orientation or sexuality. As part of the majority in that sector, in that identity, it is my job to make the norm different, so that those communities who've been marginalized do not have to face that all the time. And so it is not something that I can just turn a blind eye to, because I don't have to worry about ramps. I can walk up the stairs, but it is my part to take in sort of choosing that road of how to stand up. There's a wonderful TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie that talks about the dangers of a single story, and all of these socializations and the way that we feed into implicit bias, the sort of fog that we breathe in. Through all of our education and media and our socializations, we come to understand and associate things. So when I say peanut butter, you might think of jelly. Similar to that, and there's a wonderful video about this from the New York Times that does a series of things on implicit biases, where Black men have been portrayed heavily in our media with violence. And so people grow up thinking, whether they realize it or not, that that's in the back of their minds. And so the problem with that single story is not that stereotypes, for example, may not be true, but that they're incomplete, and that's the only story we know. And then we start making decisions and assumptions based on that, and we start treating our patients based on that. And so that's where the danger comes in. And although we have not been able to escape this in our headlines, there's something really strong about understanding our assumptions. And even though racism and structural racism have now been in the headlines, some of you may have heard when Melinda Gates went on record to say, Black folks must be vaccinated first for the COVID-19 at the healthcare workers when the vaccine actually comes out. And, this coming from this great intention, because Black folks were being really disproportionately impacted by morbidity and mortality when it came to COVID-19. But the impact that was happening was there were a lot of people who kind of rolled their arms and were like, no, thank you. This sounds like the government might want to experiment on us. Or why would you want to give us this vaccine first? And while the intention might be true, the impact landed quite wrongly on folks. And, what do you do when that happens? Do you retract and do you sort of blame people for misunderstanding or whatever? Or do you say, okay, I understand, I may not realize it, but I do have some responsibility here. And all of us have had apologies of, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to, which is not really a true apology. It's more about absolving ourselves of any guilt and responsibility. But can we move to a space where we say, I'm truly sorry that landed this way on you. What can I do to deepen this dialogue and make it better? How can I be more cognizant of that? How can I be more supportive? And so overcoming this resistance that we have really requires sort of creating these opportunities and intentional time and space for people to challenge their own assumptions, right? All of us have them. Implicit biases are just a sign that your brain works. And so we all have them, but the idea is how do we become more conscious and how do we challenge our own assumptions? And for this, I offer this methodology about sort of akin to building a photograph, right? Going into your dark room to develop something. And although the lights are off and there's this sort of faint red light, what I call the light of your soul, you know, in that room where nobody else is, where nobody can hear what you say, you know, what do you discover about yourself? And just like to develop from a negative to an actual photograph that you can then present to the world, we have to have some solvents, right? If you don't have those solvents and that sort of process, you're not going to develop your photo quite correctly. And so just like that, we have to have tools to understand our own process within that dark room. And to do that, we have to step into our own lens and offer some self-examination. Now, what you see in that dark room is going to reveal a lot about these narratives and these realities that we've grown up with and been socialized. So think of this as like maybe a deeper way to think about your Thanksgiving dinner, where that uncle might say something or somebody might say something that makes you cringe and want to just focus on the turkey or whatever it is that we eat. But really, this is about you and your own process, about self-examination and stepping into that lens, no matter how you've been socialized to be, no matter if you find things in there that may be painful for you to recognize and realize. And if you have a commitment to humility, that is at the core of this. If we have a commitment to humility, you will then start to recognize these sort of blind spots and biases that you may have. And these narratives have long been growing up with, these prevalent narratives that we've subscribed to, whether intentionally or unintentionally. This is how we start understanding and paving the way to practicing our own reflections and then healing ourselves of these narratives that have long gone unchecked. And so akin to developing a building or standing up a building construction, that foundation has to be sort of understood and analyzed, right? So I remember there was a building, right, that was built, and near that building, they found that there was a dry cleaner, and all of the chemicals, the perk had sort of seeped into the soil and sort of made that building a little bit unfit as a foundation. And so more money had to go into, more investment it took to challenge that foundation and to heal that foundation and to clean it up. And why am I saying that? Because that's kind of what's happening with the gutting of the narratives in the dark room. You need to assess that soil, that foundation that we all have, and heal it if it needs to be, treat it if it needs to be, but really understanding the good, bad, and the ugly. And that's what's going to pave the way for us to keep practicing this iterative process. It will get easier, but it does practice and pave the way for healing. So if any of you have taken a yoga class, right, that first time people take yoga and they're like, oh, what is this going to do for my body, right? This is not a real workout. And you take that yoga class and the next day or the next morning, you're kind of like, there are parts of my body that are aching that I never knew existed, right? There are muscles that you have awakened through this process that you never have been in touch with. And similar to that, this process is going to awaken things inside of you and bring these things up in you that you may not have had the chance and the intentional time and space to deal with. But it is good for you. And so as you do that, you have to think about how your own awareness is going to help you decondition these false dominant narratives. It's going to have to be something that you think about in terms of how you challenge that within you in creating this community around you who can help you to be accountable for that in a compassionate manner. But that it's not going to be easy, that they can't, you have to be called out. All of us do, but are we willing to step into that? And so that equity lens really helps us to establish these goals that we have as the Washington State Pharmacists Association, as a supervising pharmacist, as a preceptor, as a student, as a professor. Any of the spheres of influence that we have, how do we create not only SMART goals, but what I call the SMARTY goals, where we can have equity as part of that plan, just as we consider specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely, that they also need to think about equitable. And to do this, you have to think about meaningful community engagement. And the community here includes both the community external to you, but also how you're engaging your community in sense of a power dynamic, right? So people, are they afraid to speak up because of a power dynamic? Are they afraid to speak up because they're afraid to get in trouble? Or do you actually have an open door where people can challenge you and things that you've done or things that you have said that may have landed the wrong way? And what is your response to that vulnerability? Again, do you tense up, shut down, or do you say, I'm going to take a minute and I'm going to really seek this in? And that's how we start understanding how to challenge the status quo. So when we think about values such as equity and social justice and inclusion and accountability, we actually have to then build those things into our spheres of influence, whether you're a head of an organization to do strategic planning with, whether you have a team and you're responsible for 3 people or 4 people, whether it's with your patients who you're helping to make decisions about. You know, do you have transparency? Are these people at the table, the people who are impacted by your decision? Are they actually at the table in understanding how these decisions are going to impact them? And then I want to leave with this idea of capacity building, that just the way that, you know, everything as a leader may rely on me, I would venture for us to invite us to say that it has to be a collective. There's this beautiful quote that actually talks about critical change doesn't actually result from critical mass. It doesn't result from when you've reached this critical mass, that tipping point that we think about. It's actually the power of critical networks. It's these coalitions, it's these groups and these connections that we form that actually then lead to transformative change. And so do we think about our communities? Do we ask if they're at the table? Do we give them shared leadership and decision making? And remembering that, you know, in reflecting on that, what does that look like in your own sphere of influence? So akin to sort of Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, when we talk about the circle of concern, maybe world poverty or world hunger, our circle of influence is much smaller usually. And so I invite you to think about what this looks like in your own sphere of influence. If you go through these sessions with the annual meeting, when we think about ways that our patients are impacted, how do we have agency? And we all do. We all have the power. We all have the empowerment. We just need to recognize it and step into it. That we are no longer just okay being a bystander. It is not okay to say, well, you know, I'm not in a position of leadership. We all have agency. Do you recognize it or do you not? And do you have a community around you who can remind you of that accountability, who can remind you of your empowerment, of just how powerful you are in making that difference? And so in this sphere of influence, one of the kind of inventory or checkpoints that we also need to do is, what more do we need to learn? What are the perspectives in the room, but what are the perspectives that are missing from the room, and how do we seek that out in a humble and professional manner where we are giving somebody their due dignity and their due respect to actually learn from them? And so when we think about equality, which has been sort of this narrative of the past, we've talked about equity. I am not interested in putting Band-Aids on the system, although a lot of our response tends to be that way. What we really need to think about is how to break down those barriers in the first place. And that's truly the only way for us to reach to this point of liberation where we can break these barriers and force ourselves in a very, very actionable and intentional way where we can join hands and truly understand how we can be there for our patients through our profession. And I remind us all that just like Ralph Waldo Emerson offered, that life is a journey and not a destination. This process of understanding how to dismantle structural racism is going to be a journey. It is not something that we can check the box on. It is not a destination we can get to. It is an ever-evolving journey that we are going to have to just be a little bit uncomfortable with and partake in. And for that, I offer just a little bit of reflection as all of you think about how to do this in your own spheres of influence.
You're broken down and tired, living life on the merry-go-round. You can't find a fighter, I see it in you, so we gon' walk it out. Ooh. Mountain, we gon' walk it out. Mountain, and I'll rise like the day, I'll rise unafraid, I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. And I'll rise up, I like the waves, I'll rise up, silence is quiet, and it feels like it's getting hard to breathe. And I know you feel like dying, but I promise we'll take the world to its feet. Okay, bring it to its feet. I'm dead, and I'll rise up. I'll rise like today. I'll rise up. I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. That we have each other, and we will rise, we will rise, we will rise, we'll rise. I'll rise up, rise like the day, I'll rise up, in spite of the age. I will rise 1,000 times again, and we'll rise up. I like the waves. We'll rise up in spite of the age. We'll rise up, and we'll do it 1,000 times again.
So with that, I offer us to think about the ways in which we can change some of this narrative. I'm happy to take any questions you might have at this time.
Thank you so much, Vibhuti, for that call to power, that permission to be vulnerable. I really appreciate that. We do have a couple of great questions. Janice, I'm going to unmute you in just a moment. But Ryan Ofterbro had a great question that I think that you'd love to address, which as we are creating these brave spaces within our organizations, how should leaders handle mistakes, their own or within their team?
That's a really, thanks, Ryan, for that question. Oops, do you hear an echo?
Nope.
I think, oh, okay. I think that one thing would be to examine if that conversation is even possible within our work environment. So, for example, I think that as we think about it, how do we engage with people? One of the things that I sort of offer to sometimes my students and the colleagues that when I do these presentations is, rather than even saying something as, you know, do you agree or disagree, think about what's a different perspective I haven't considered yet. And, you know, it kind of takes the blame off a person, kind of takes the spotlight off if I say I disagree, because then I'm the other person that disagrees, and there's a certain power dynamic there. And so it's really important to examine what the power dynamics are within our organizations. Having an intentional time and space to do this is really important. So, you know, don't have somebody come to your office to have this conversation, because that's your office, it's your territory. Maybe go to a coffee shop, or maybe go to a conference room or something that doesn't designate that territory as yours or theirs, or you can go to theirs. So I think one of the things is doing that. The other thing is, there are two questions that I always kind of ask people to write down. One is sort of intention versus impact, right? What was my intention and what was the impact? And now let's try to connect the two, right? Why did my intention lead to that impact? And question number two is, what are the assumptions there, right? We all have assumptions that we make. And I liken this a little bit to sort of maybe even in partnership. So I have, I coach, doing DEI coaching for some folks, and there was a dynamic within a person in their supervisor and then the person I was coaching, who wanted to have a conversation. And, you know, I joke that when I want to talk to my partner, I kind of like, hey, we need a board meeting right now, right? So we know it's about to happen. We know something's going to come up that may be a little bit uncomfortable. This is a great tool to use to talk about in-laws maybe. But really the idea here is to kind of have a very shared intentional space that offers you to be vulnerable with each other. And so these two individuals have baseball in common. So the way that I have kind of navigated and helped them to set up a standing meeting is to have the framework of, you know, we're about to have a baseball conversation, right? And so we're either going to hit it a home run or we're going to strike out, but let's explore. And so both of them come with a certain vulnerabilities. They're both allowed to like sort of hear it out. So I think that the processes and the ways with which you facilitate conversation is really important. And embracing the discomfort. I think it's going to be uncomfortable for everybody. It's not just white folks who get uncomfortable with these conversations. It's not just men who get uncomfortable with these conversations, but they're harmful to all, right? So let's think about how it is that we can make it so that we're going to have this conversation where, you know, do a round robin. Everybody gets to say a statement, and then let's explore. The intention versus impact is a really great way, because it kind of intellectualizes a little bit, so you can kind of delve into problem solving, and allows people their vulnerability to be handheld a little bit. And I am all about being brave. You know, it doesn't mean that you just kind of leave it. We do have to check each other, but you know, and you know your team, sometimes humor helps too. But it's really important to say, okay, how do we have this conversation? Where do we have this conversation? What time of the day are you having it? Please do not have it on a Friday at 4 p.m., you know, or a Monday at 9 a.m., right? So how do you usually frame these things? I don't know if that helps, but that might offer a little bit, those two things, intention versus impact and checking our assumptions, might offer a good framework into starting those conversations and pushing ourselves to be brave.
Thank you. Wonderful question. I'm looking for more hands and more thoughts and more questions. Right now, I don't have many. You clearly have watched me doing yoga though, with that. But I think one of the interesting things that I will bring up in this discussion is that redlining isn't just an issue that was confined to a few old cities or to the South. Seattle had redline areas, Spokane had redline areas, Tacoma had redline areas, Vancouver, many of our metropolitan areas, and probably even our suburban areas had redline districts. And you can very clearly see areas of disparity and upper mobility or different trends in our cities based on where those historic redlining districts were. So I think that you can dive into your own history of where you lived and where you were from and where you grew up, as well as where you currently live, to kind of better understand some of that history and embrace that it's relevant even on this our little liberal bubble of the west side of Washington. It applies all across our state here as an issue that impacts.
Yeah, and I will say that there's a book about this called The Color of Law, which is a fascinating read if you would be so interested and inclined in thinking about the impact of redlining. But I will say one of the most important things also is to, people ask me sort of like, Vibhuti, why do you do this work, right? Like it's a lot of emotional labor, and it's hard. It's difficult to navigate some of the interpersonal ways. And I think, I always say, I just want to inspire conversation. Like, this is not meant to change people or solve this. remember that in our history, particularly in this country, we've had slavery for a lot longer than we've not had slavery, right? We've had these problematic practices for a lot longer than we've been quote unquote woke as a people, right? And so it's important. I think the election already has revealed so much that we're all just going to have to sit with. And as people are on edge, as a person who did theater, every time we were at backstage, our directors would come. The way we were trained was like, okay, take that nervous energy and channel it into your performance. Right. And so in this conversation, the way that I invite folks into that brave space is take that, what you're feeling. That's why I say emotions are data, right? Take that and channel it into this conversation. If you need to have tears, have tears. If you need to get exasperated, be exasperated. We've set up this culture where I think that it's sets us back a little bit because it's so focused on being good and professional and saying the right thing that people are actually afraid to talk. And what you want to do is deepen that dialogue. And that process is difficult. And if it's not uncomfortable, you're not doing it right, right? So the idea is not to hide and shy away from conversation, it's to have more. And what I'll say is that more often than not, things get worse before they get better, just like they will in this country as a whole, right? You need to understand and delve into, as Jenny, you're explaining with this history, it's gonna be painful. It's gonna be difficult. And it's hard, and pace yourself. Have a glass of wine if you need to, but you need to pace yourself and understand that the stuff that comes out, right? So this building that was being built was actually the APHA's new headquarters, a new building. And, it sets the timeline back a little bit, and it requires more investment. But the idea is you can't ignore it because the foundation of this amazing building is going to crumble, right? And so if we want to do this right, we need to make sure that our foundations are gutted of this problematic stuff to pave way again for that healing. And it's an iterative process. You have to come back to it over and over again. And sometimes we're on top of the world and we feel great, and sometimes we don't feel good. And more often than not, we might not feel that great. But that's why it's so important to have people around you who can, and I'm very deliberate about creating a community of folks who also are disconfirming in their opinion, as I am, right? So we don't always think the same or feel the same, but they're all committed. And that's the importance of the work, that you have to have a commitment.
And I think people are just digesting and kind of thinking through this a lot. I don't see a lot of discussion or hands raised and questions. So, Michael Alwan, you have your hand raised. I'll go ahead and unmute you. Go ahead, Michael.
All right, can you hear me? Good, excellent, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Arya, for just a fantastic presentation today. I definitely what Jenny was saying as far as digesting and, and starting some of the reflection from many of the points on this. And I really appreciated your answer to the last question of some suggestions on how to handle these discussions, or what, people make mistakes. I guess I would like to take that a little bit further as we look to try and spread these discussions in our organizations. Do you have suggestions or guidance of how to help develop people that can facilitate these discussions or help stimulate that a little bit more? I think one of the things we run into is we want to have the discussion, but then we look around and we say, okay, who's going to start? And how best, or if you have examples of other organizations that have done that really well that you've seen as well.
Yeah, so that's what I do for a living now, but basically the facilitation is important, and having sort of sometimes it helps to have a neutral body, sometimes it helps to identify champions within your organization who are willing to lead that discussion, but being careful also not to have that token one person of color do it, because then the burden lies on them and people are afraid to say things to them. There's a lot of nuances involved that I think really bring up what's happening. One of the things that I will say, I've created this tool similar to that trans-theoretical model of change, the Prochaska model with substance use, is the organizational readiness to have this discussion. So I've built that, and I've kind of put in, borrowed their model and put in language around. So that's how I also now screen some clients into understanding sort of where they are for that discussion. I think it takes a very frank conversation with leadership to have about how how ready they might be in engaging in this discomfort, and talking through. And that has to happen internally. I think that having a facilitator is not just going to be like a unicorn where they come in and just fix everything and say everything is great and move on. I think it's going to uncover a lot of things. And there's in our, what I've been taught in conversations on racial justice, there's this model that we use, a systems approach to transformative change. And the idea here is to think about an organization not as a structure of like policies and standards and procedures and kind of like a clock, like mechanical things. It's more of a beehive where how individuals act and behave and perform within that organization actually creates the dynamic and furthers the norms and the organizational culture, right? So the idea that a system is just the sum of its parts, actually we take it further and say it's not just the sum of its parts, it's the interaction of those parts. So how do you all behave, right? How do we all behave in our power structures at work that say, okay, well, if Jenny's my boss and I say something to Jenny, hey, Jenny, I want to talk to you, that didn't really, this is bothering me, does magically the next opportunity that comes my way vanishes? Does, do I not get invited to the inner circle next time, right? Like there are all these ways in which you get retaliated against. And as a recipient of that and as a participant in that process, because I have received those things doing my work, listen, it's where people are at, it's how they respond to their own vulnerabilities. But I would suggest maybe having a very frank, again, going into the dark room and knowing, am I ready for this? And it's okay if you're not, you just need to tell yourself the truth and name it. And perhaps it is an opportunity. So we say any event or any conversation, that happens is like the tip of the iceberg, but under that iceberg really is all the stuff that we need to examine, like the norms of that situation, the mental models and assumptions of where people are coming from. It's the patterns that have been developed, right? And so that's really important because that will inform how you respond to that tip of the iceberg of those situations that happen. So I want to create an environment as a supervisor, as a person of a power figure, right? Even in my classroom. Right. So that's why I offer not my students to agree or disagree with me, because they all will probably want to agree with me because I'm writing their letter of recommendation and giving them a grade. So I always say, what's a perspective that we haven't discussed yet? And so they'll offer these perspectives and we get into the conversation and it's okay. I give my students double the points for disagreeing with me or offering the different perspective, because I don't want them to articulate opinions that are mine. I want them to articulate and apply these processes to their own lived experiences and how they take that job of doing the right thing, right? How do you commit to doing this work, even when it's not convenient to you, even when you may offend somebody or run the risk of, people ask, like, I don't want to speak up because what if they fire me, right? Or what, that tells you a lot about the organization and the culture that's been established there. And so I think that, again, to what you're saying, Michael, it's going a little bit further and saying, how do we be real with ourselves, right? Keeping it real, in understanding where we are in that conversation. And once we're ready for that, look around you in the room or in that organization. What are the perspectives you need? What are you missing? What are the narratives that are both in and not in the room? And, have a very frank conversation of where you guys are as an organization or as a team. And when I say frank, I mean not just the leadership speaking, but also, again, understanding power dynamics and sort of how you can empower staff and those who are not in positions of leadership to feel comfortable to speak up. So that was a really long answer, but I hope that clarifies.
Yes, that was great. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that builds on another question that one other person has, which is, when you are in work environments that are risky and toxic and kind of potential for retaliation, how can you be in that place, even if you're a white person in that environment, and coming up and talking about that has a risk. And it sounds like give yourself permission to know whether or not that's a risk that is the right one for you to personally take at that moment. But I think that what I also hear you saying is being direct about it and approaching probably that leader in a private, closed way where you can really have that discussion perhaps, versus just dropping hints or trying to undercut, maybe perhaps is a way to deal with that head on, but also at least going out openly and defending the people who might be at risk, defending individuals who are not being respected and recognized, perhaps, maybe.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd offer to that is our two sort of readiness steps, right? One is, if you do think it's risky, I always am more interested in building coalitions than I am in acting as an individual, right? So as an individual, you can do, remember what I said about the quote about the critical mass. It's not the number of people that are big and will do something. It's the networks, it's the connections. So find a mentor outside of your organization who you can talk to about this. You know, find somebody who does this work, who can give you some language and framework. I've been doing this a lot lately where, you know, I offer, and some of my white colleagues who are like, I want to bring this up, but I am now typecasted as that person who keeps bringing this up or whatever. Now, there's two things, right? So one is that coalition, like who are your allies? Who's in there that you know sticks with you or understands your point of view? And I call this strategic disruption, right? So you have to think about where in those, in that organization, can you find room? You know, sometimes it can work and sometimes it just doesn't. And that's okay to recognize and accept. And then the other, so positioning yourself to strategically find coalitions or allies where you can kind of have that support and form a group. And, you know, a lot of times that's, hey, a few of us are getting together to be this committee, or a few of us would love to put on a program about X. So then it kind of takes you out of the question a little bit and not like have a spotlight. You know, and I think if you feel comfortable with your leadership to go in their office and talk about this, that's fine. I would say not in their office. You know, meet the vulnerability where it is, be at a neutral space, and or have them come to your office if you have one, and if you feel that that's something that boosts your morale and confidence. It should not be the other way around, right? Because you're already vulnerable taking this topic to them. So I would suggest kind of bringing it out of that element. And if you don't feel comfortable, I'm assuming that if you don't feel comfortable speaking up, you're likely not going to go to your leader and talk about it in private, because maybe there's something there that's not making you feel comfortable. So again, coalition, community, allyship. But the other thing is questioning what that even means about being risky, right? So there is a narrative about, you know, having a responsibility to speak up even when it's not convenient to you, right? Because for a long time, people care to a certain point, right? Like, we raise our children to make sure that they can confront these things and speak up and be good citizens, yet we don't model that behavior all the time because we turn the other cheek because it doesn't apply to us directly. And I would venture to say, if you're truly committed and figure out how to get yourself there where you're able to articulate and speak up even when it's not convenient to you, because folks of color who bring up these kinds of things, we're always taking risks every single time. So let's, as a majority, also share in that risk, like an ACO, right? Like, let's be accountable care organization where we can take that sort of shared risk model and not only have it be for folks of color to bring these things up. And I think that's really important for allyship, right? To be an active person who can take that risk, and that speaks volumes. And I think as long as we can figure out how to build coalitions so we can all get there, that's going to be really important.
I think that was some really good tips that person will take away. Actually, I think all of us will take away. Steve, you have a great question. I'm going to unmute you.
Thanks. Very good talk. I appreciate that. I wanted to just ask, I've been involved in a book club, and one of the things we're reading right now is Kennedy's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And we're not through yet, so maybe we'll get the answer in the book. But one of the things as I'm going through that, I get, and I've had some conversations with people about, if you would, racist activity versus institutional racism. And I guess I understand there's institutional racism, but I'm still struggling with how to articulate that as I'm having the conversation with others. I think it's helpful, the information you shared on equal versus equality, because I think a lot of the people I've been having this conversation with and do not believe there's institutional racism is because they're really stuck on that concept itself. So I don't know if you have any words of advice on how to maybe help me improve articulating on how to have that conversation about what is institutional racism. Again, this is very helpful.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. And thank you for being brave to ask that question. I think that a lot of people are struggling with that, frankly. And part of that is because their lived experiences have not allowed them to be in spaces where they can see how that can actually perpetuate structural racism, right? And that's okay. But being sort of awakened to it now, it's going to be incremental. It's going to take time. And so I think that asking questions is a fantastic way to think about our own assumptions, right? So what does this say about privilege? I wonder if, like I've been part of a lot of these workshops that I've done with, like, for example, like admissions or other folks who are trying to understand recruitment strategies, but it's not just like getting people to the table, it's making sure the environment supports them, right? So it's not an organization saying, I want to hire 3 Black people. It's saying that if somebody makes comments, are you willing to understand and call that out, right? And so the idea here is for folks who are having trouble understanding anti-racism, there's maybe there's also kind of a coming back to that convenience issue where I liken it to sort of, it's not that you haven't worked hard, because a lot of these narratives and where that comes from is, we've also worked really hard and nothing gave me a benefit. I've worked hard to get to where I am. And this idea is not about minimizing people's struggles. And very specifically for white folks, it's not saying that like you never had to work hard. It's bringing to the surface other folks' struggles who'd have to dodge a lot of things, right? That perhaps some of us didn't have to dodge. And so the idea of movement here is that institutional racism as a set of policies and practices, so networking reception, so getting the word out about internships, so assuming that, when you make the call about sort of everybody, being furloughed or something, that, it's going to hit folks the same way, right? There's certain privileges that institutions assume their employees have, but that are going to be different for different people. And so I think that, again, going back to understand what is it in an organization, frankly, again, inventorying, right? Like who's here and who's at the table, who's our leadership? Are these opportunities extended to many people? And there are lots of data and statistics on this as well. I think gender is a good way to approach that conversation as well, because people understand, I think in this day and age, how the gender inequity issue has manifested and is hurting people. Right, so women globally are about 70% of the healthcare workforce, for example, but less than a quarter in leadership roles, right? That's a disparity. How do you explain that? So institutionally, we talk about what's the path to leadership, right? What do you need to show? So fathers may get paternity leave, but there are lots of opportunities and language that happens that says, well, she's pregnant, she's going out on leave soon, so let's not have her head this project, right? So that opportunity doesn't even get there. Right, it doesn't allow that woman the opportunity to say, hey, why don't you get started, establish a vision, and then hand it off to your team, or establish a succession plan, or whatever the case may be. So that experience never gets to be hers. And so over time, as these lack of experiences accumulate, when she applies for a leadership role or he applies for a leadership role, she has less experience, right? So these are ways in which the pathways have been kind of talked about, right? Like full professors. I am super happy that I became full professor recently, but even looking in that market, like where are the women full professors? And they just never get there because there's just a lot of stuff that you have to do. They tend to have, babies, and that shouldn't demarcate what your professional success is. So I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of examples in some of these structures and processes that, perhaps you can use gender as like a foray into having that conversation about race and ethnicity. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you. I turned off my camera because I was having to look at you and look attentive instead of taking my notes like I wanted on what you were saying. So I just wanted to appreciate you and listen and take my notes. We only have a few minutes left here, about 5 minutes left in this discussion, but one thing that I know you and I share is that we're raising little humans in this time. We're parents, and I know that we have a lot of parents and grandparents on this call. What are some approaches to raising children that can really thrive in this world and meet the challenges and be open with them? What are some things that maybe you've done or you recommend that we can do to kind of help our children be aware of themselves in this space?
Thank you. That's a perfect question in timeliness. I found specifically doing this work that I do, parenting, to be the most challenging thing, because I was having to navigate a lot of emotional labor and all this stress on my own self, and then having to also be there for children and explain what's going on. My children, thankfully, they know I do racism work, so they're always like, "Shh, mommy's doing a talk about racism." And my 6-year-old was like, "What kind of racism today?" And I was like, "Structural." And they're like, "Okay." And I'm like, that's parenting win. She can't tie her shoelaces, but she can rap Hamilton, and she knows there are different types of racism. So that's a parenting win in my book. But I think that what you're really talking about is also the notion of accountability. I actually use parenting as an example when I facilitate some workshops about organizational change. So just the way I mentioned about how people perform in that organization, how those structures and policies are, kind of contribute to the norm. And this came to me because my kid came over, and basically I was doing something and she was like, "Oh, this thing broke." And I was like, "Okay, thank you for letting me know." And I thought to myself, if I freaked out or if I blamed her and got mad about things breaking, that behavior will likely lead to her not telling me something is broken, right? Because there's a punitive kind of quality to that behavior. And so in a household, is kind of like your beehive, your organization. The norms that you create and the processes that you create are going to be very telling about how those kids reflect and tell you things, right? And so I treat my children as they have their own opinions, and I ask them, what do you think about things? And I engage them very deliberately in conversations about power and who has the right to speak, and do you think you have a voice at the table, and what if you disagree with mama and daddy, and what do you do? And so I think that part of that kind of creating that norm is really understanding and giving them the voice and power, and being vulnerable enough to say, like, I don't know, that makes me very uncomfortable. I imagine that a lot of decisions that come from parenting about what schools kids should go to, and et cetera, all that is because parents are not ready to have these conversations. And so I think it's really important to talk to the children about, like, ooh, that makes me really uncomfortable, and get into it with them, expose your dark room to them, get into it so that they can see that you're also vulnerable. I have a feeling that when they get to be of a certain age, when they have vulnerabilities, they're going to come to you and talk to you about it because they associate you with being vulnerable and that being okay. But if you're a perfect mom or perfect dad who's never vulnerable and doesn't talk about things that don't make you uncomfortable, they probably will be at a point where they're like, I can't talk to my mom about this because she's, always have everything figured out, or whatever the case may be. So I'm very deliberate about having those discussions with my kids. The other thing I'll say and leave it with is saying that facilitating those conversations and asking kids to kind of give you their opinion is really important, because it helps them articulate what they think. And so I think that's really, really important. The variables that I had to assess and make conclusions with in life are not going to be the same variables that my children will have to assess and make conclusions with. But if I can give them the process, that's really about what it is, right? It's like in math. 2 + 2 may be 4, maybe they're adding different numbers, but as long as they know how to add, that's good. So giving them a process is important, and exposing your vulnerability to them is really important.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate and taken a lot away from this discussion, lots of pearls of wisdom for WSPA, for my own life and household. And I know everybody else on the call or expresses that also, lots of comments that have come up. So thank you, V-Beauty, for teleporting yourself here all the way from New York today. I wish we got to have you here in person, my friend. And hopefully this is the beginning of many good conversations like this to come. So thank you so much. We appreciate it a great deal.
Yeah, thank you for choosing this topic. Thank you for furthering the conversation and being brave to engage in this. And I really appreciate your having me here.
Thank you. And thanks to our board of directors. They've created our diversity, equity, and inequality work group so that we can also, as an organization, continue to have many of these conversations. So thank you so much, V-Beauty.
Thank you.